Hey guys, thanks for joining me again today. Today we're going to learn about the 1960s and JFK, his assassination, and the takeover of LBJ. So, we're looking at the election of 1960. The Republicans nominate Vice President Richard Nixon. He had been vice president under Eisenhower, and he was pretty famous for traveling throughout the world as like a troubleshooter in foreign policy issues, like his visit to the USSR with Khrushchev and the whole kitchen debates, and I'm going to have a picture on the next slide for you, and just trying his best to diminish Cold War tensions, while the Democrats will nominate Senator John F. Kennedy, and LBJ, Lyndon B. Johnson, will be Kennedy. The Senate Majority Leader was actually Kennedy's running mate. And Kennedy, there are some, oh, hold on, let me show you the picture first. The kitchen debates with Nikita Khrushchev and Richard Nixon. I promise you guys I'd show you a picture of them in the kitchen, which is kind of interesting. JFK will actually win this election. We'll talk about with his election in a minute, but in his acceptance speech, he basically lays it out for Americans and say that sacrifice is what makes Americans, and that to achieve greatness, people are going to have to sacrifice. We stand today on the edge of a new frontier, which was his campaign. The frontier of the 1960s, a frontier of unknown opportunities and paths, a frontier of unfulfilled hopes and threats. The new frontier I speak of is not a set of promises, it is a set of challenges. So some issues with Kennedy's campaign here. Kennedy was Catholic, and that was new for Americans. We had never had a Catholic president before. We had either had like kind of non-religious, but like proclaimed Christianity presidents, or like Protestants. So it was a major issue because people were fearful of, well, in Catholicism, we've got the Pope is at the top and you do what the Pope says, essentially. So is the Pope going to rule America? And it was just like an absolutely ridiculous fear. But Kennedy kind of denounced all of this when he said that he accepts the idea of separation of church and state, and that Catholic leaders just wouldn't be telling him how to run the presidency. We also saw during his election that there were debates on live TV. And here's what kind of separates JFK. People who listened on the radio heard Nixon and JFK and was like, Nixon's going to win for sure. Because Nixon was a pretty eloquent speaker, whereas JFK had a really thick northern accent. And I'm not going to try and do it for you. But people who watched it on TV definitely thought that JFK had won because he was just more charismatic and more present in that way. And I'm a little bit crushing on him, I gotta admit. Kennedy earned the support of African Americans when he actually arranged to have Martin Luther King Jr. released from a jail in Georgia. He wrote to Martin Luther King Jr.'s sister or wife, one of those, and basically said, like, I'm going to try and get him out of jail. And the African American community like really supported that, obviously, because Martin Luther King Jr. was protesting for their rights, and that's what landed him in a jail in Georgia. When we're looking at the map, JFK won by the popular vote and the electoral college vote, and we had like an independent running. But for the most part, we do see we see elections normalizing starting in this time period based on what we see today, where a lot of the South will vote more Republican and the North will vote more Democrat. It's shifting into that area during this election. Kennedy is a little bit different as president because he's just a different dude. He's very young, one of the youngest. Him and Teddy Roosevelt were our youngest presidents. He's the only Catholic. He will, during his only term in office, he will have a majority in Congress for most of the time. Democrats will sweep both houses. And one of his most popular quotes here is in his first inaugural speech when he says, "Ask not what your country can do for you, but ask what you can do for your country," kind of carrying that idea of his new frontier of making sacrifices, and we're on the precipice of a new decade, and let's do something good with it. When we look at Kennedy's domestic policy, keep in mind we only have about 3 years to look at before his assassination, and we will see him kind of go down the middle of the road here, where some things are very successful and some things are not. So when it comes to legislative failures, while there are Democrats in both houses, there's still a stronghold of conservative Democrats coming from southern states. And so while they are part of his party, they will actually block a lot of his plans for federal aid to education, for urban renewal like housing projects, medical care for the aid like Medicare and Medicaid, those sort of things, reduction of income taxes, and creation of a new Department of the Government of Urban Affairs. And all those things that I just said will later on be passed, because when Kennedy is assassinated, LBJ becomes president, and he kind of uses Kennedy's death to get things passed. Like, Kennedy wanted this, we all loved Kennedy, kind of, I don't want to call it waving the bloody shirt like people do after wars, but it's like that in a sense. Successes, though, minimum wage will be raised from $1 to $1.25 an hour, and it will actually, minimum wage will be extended to more sectors of the economy and 3 million more workers. We will see more government money put into like housing projects, area redevelopment, a lot in urban areas, and also like very, very rural areas, to help those in distress, to help build up the economy, prop up the economy in those areas. And then the steel industry had like this large price increase, and Kennedy was successful, and they call it jawboning, kind of like bending them to his will in a sense, to stop steel prices from rising. Major domestic successes for Kennedy, we're going to look at the space race here. So the USSR puts up another Sputnik app. They have like their Sputnik program, and the U.S. launches our Mercury and Gemini programs, and the first programs aren't go to the moon. The first programs are just simply to get technology into space and be able to track it and bring it back down successfully, instead of letting it burn up in Earth's atmosphere or just float around forever as space junk. So we're pretty successful in sending a man to the moon. Our first men to space. Our first man in space was John Glenn, who actually recently died. But JFK is successful in pushing the space program and making it part of the Cold War and trying to get that new technology and be more of that world superpower. He asks Congress for $24 billion to expand NASA. And here's a quote from him promising to put a man on the moon in a decade. This nation should commit itself to achieving the goal before the decade is out of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth, which is more of the difficult part of that mission. So here we have scientists working on Sputnik, and then we have Mercury and Gemini astronauts as well. And keep in mind that, yes, we think of NASA as the astronauts who go up into space, is millions more people than just the astronauts going into space. It is technicians, it is electricians and mechanics and accountants. It's child care workers that watch your kids while you go work for NASA. It's a massive operation. Kind of think of it like a military base. It's mostly located in Texas and Florida during this time period. And here is the Apollo 11 mission in 1969. All of the world is watching this on TV. 2 American astronauts successfully touched down on the moon, Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin, while the third is up in the shuttle orbiting the moon to bring them back. And we are successful, and we'll send a lot more moon missions in years to come. All right, so write these things down. Again, we are going to go over more over civil rights by itself of its own thing. Sorry, lunch just let out. Do you hear them? And so just write these things down, and we will talk more about them in class. I do want to say really quickly, though, that JFK didn't really do anything in his first 2 years, and towards his last year, he was moving towards more accepting of civil rights and signing those things into law. Many of the civil rights initiatives that he will put forth or that happened during his time period are more symbolic. But the issue is that he will be assassinated, and we don't really know what he would have done if he had stuck around, if he would have taken the path that LBJ took by signing all those civil rights bills if he had been president. All right, so looking at Kennedy and the Cold War, we got some issues here. Some major things go down in just the 3 short years that Kennedy is president. Kennedy's response to the Cold War is called flexible response. Let me flip in my notes here, friends. So we're looking at Kennedy wanting to increase conventional military tactics and strategies, so cooperation, communication, regular weapons and foot soldiers and defense in that way, rather than using nuclear weapons. But nuclear weapons are still an option. So be flexible in the way you respond. Can you communicate first? Can you do a blockade? Can you do an embargo? We don't just have to jump to nuclear weapons because we have nuclear weapons. So actually, even though this is like not a nuclear buildup thing, there's going to be a huge military buildup during this time period, not just nuclear weapons wise, like large defense spending in a sense, which is different for a Democrat if we think about that today in our modern mind. So this just replaces Eisenhower's heavy reliance on nuclear weapons that we had seen in the previous decade. JFK will also set up the Green Berets, which is like an elite commando force, and test them out during his time as president. All right, probably the biggest foreign policy failure of Kennedy is the Bay of Pigs. So this is actually Eisenhower's idea. 1960-ish, before Kennedy is elected, before he's inaugurated, Eisenhower authorizes the CIA to organize, train, and arm Central America using Cuban exiles. So people who had fled from Cuba come to the United States. We train them, and our goal is to train them and send them back to Cuba and overthrow Castro, who had come out of the communist closet. Okay, so the invaders would hopefully show up, be like, we want to take over Cuba, and a bunch of Cubans would be like, yeah, we'll help you, and it would trigger a popular uprising. It would trigger a civil war. And the reason that Eisenhower comes up with this is Eisenhower doesn't like Castro. Castro's a communist. Castro has hinted that he's going to turn towards the Soviet Union and create an alliance with the Soviet Union. And Cuba's really close to Florida. And so that's scary in a sense of if they were to put missiles in Cuba, hint, hint, they do, that they would be able to reach the United States. And so that's why the Bay of Pigs was put together. But Eisenhower doesn't run for re-election, and, well, he can't. But Eisenhower is no longer president. He's got this plan, but Kennedy's the dude that has to press the button and say, okay, let's go. So here's the invasion. It begins, and then it ends. So here we go. April 1961, the Bay of Pigs invasion. They show up. There were Castro's forces waiting for them. They're pinned down immediately. There's a plane that sees that going on, a Cuban exile, and flies back to America and lands in Key West. So it's like totally out to the world that America was involved because we let that plane land in Key West, so we should have known. I guess we knew what was going on. So it was a disaster from the beginning. So Kennedy had decided that direct intervention, like sending troops, wasn't going to work, so he pressed go on this, but then this was a major failure. In 3 days, we have a bunch of men captured, a bunch of men killed. Only 14 of our Cuban exiles were rescued, and the significance of this is that it makes Kennedy look bad. It makes him look sneaky. It makes the CIA look sneaky to the Soviet Union. They perceive us like that. And Cuba now, they didn't trust us before, they super don't trust us now. And Cuba will turn to the USSR for protection against the United States. So, Bay of Pigs is direct cause of the Cuban Missile Crisis, which next. In 1962 is a year-ish after Bay of Pigs. And America has been using those U-2 spy planes, the high-altitude planes with the cool cameras on them, to take pictures. And then we got one shot down and it was a disaster. But we continue to use them because they're effective. And we see an American mission bring back pictures of Cuba with their U-2 spy planes that show that they are building nuclear missiles and that they have the parts, but the actual warhead, the detonator, is not there yet. And so when we look at a map from Cuba, if they were to send one of these surface-to-air missiles, it would destroy almost all of America, all of our major cities, except for the tip of Idaho, Oregon, and Washington State. So our entire continent is in range of these missiles, and this becomes an issue quite quickly. Oh, yeah, there's a picture for you. Perfect. All right, so here is the precipice that JFK is on. He can, let me find out where I am. He could order a naval blockade or a quarantine, and that would stop any further building of missiles. If they completely blockade all of Cuba, nothing else could be brought in. He could order bombing strikes and start a war. he could send soldiers and start a war. And so he chooses, this is his flexible response, he chooses to quarantine Cuba, in a sense, to blockade them, not only of military goods, but consumer goods as well, and food and supplies and those sort of things.